My name is Isabella, and for 29 years, I've been living a double life that my own family knows nothing about. While my cousin Vanessa flaunts her trust fund and designer handbags, constantly reminding me that I'm the poor relative who shops at thrift stores, she has no idea that I'm the anonymous designer behind some of the most coveted dresses worn by celebrities on red carpets worldwide. The irony was about to become deliciously apparent when she insulted me one too many times, and I decided to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. If you're enjoying this story of hidden talent and family drama, please subscribe and let me know what city you're watching from in the comments below. The morning that changed everything started like any other family gathering at my Aunt Catherine's sprawling estate. I pulled up in my modest Honda Civic, parking next to a lineup of luxury vehicles that could have funded a small country's annual budget. My cousin Vanessa's bright red Ferrari gleamed in the morning sun, a deliberate statement about the vast financial gulf that separated us, or so she believed. I walked through the ornate front doors, carrying a simple gift bag containing homemade cookies I'd baked the night before. The gesture was genuine. I actually enjoyed baking as a way to unwind after long days hunched over my drafting table, sketching designs that would eventually grace the runways of Paris and Milan. But I knew Vanessa would interpret my homemade offering as further evidence of my inability to afford proper gifts from expensive boutiques. "Oh, look, everyone. Isabella's here with her little care package," Vanessa announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear, her voice dripping with the condescension that had become her signature tone whenever addressing me. She was draped in what I recognized as a Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her champagne glass as she gestured dismissively in my direction. "How sweet of you to bring cookies again," she continued, examining her reflection in the ornate mirror that dominated one wall of the sitting room. "Though I'm sure store-bought would have been fine. I know your budget doesn't allow for much extravagance." I forced a smile and handed the bag to my aunt, who at least had the grace to look embarrassed by her daughter's behavior. Catherine had always been kind to me, though she'd never attempted to rein in Vanessa's increasingly cruel commentary about my lifestyle choices. I suspect she viewed our dynamic as harmless sibling rivalry, rather than the systematic humiliation campaign it had become over the years. "Actually, I made them myself," I replied calmly, settling into one of the antique chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "I find baking relaxing after work." "Oh, right. Your little job at that. What do you call it? Art supply store?" Vanessa's laugh was like broken glass, sharp and cutting. "How wonderfully creative of you. I'm sure it's very fulfilling, helping other people buy the materials to create actual art." If she only knew. My little job was actually a carefully constructed cover story that allowed me to maintain the anonymity that was crucial to my real career. I did work with art supplies in a sense. The finest silks, the most exquisite beadwork, fabrics so rare that they were allocated to only the most prestigious fashion houses in the world. But Vanessa's narrow worldview couldn't conceive of anything beyond the obvious, anything that didn't conform to her understanding of how success should look and sound. "It pays the bills," I said with a shrug, playing my part in the charade that had protected my secret for years. The truth was that my anonymous work had made me financially comfortable enough to live anywhere I wanted, to buy anything I desired. But I'd grown attached to my modest apartment in the arts district, surrounded by genuine creatives who valued substance over status. My simple wardrobe was a choice, not a necessity, though Vanessa would never believe that, even if I told her directly. "Barely, I'm sure," Vanessa continued, clearly warming to her favorite topic. "I mean, look at you. That sweater has seen better days, hasn't it? And those jeans, are those from a thrift store?" She wasn't wrong about the thrift store, though her tone suggested she thought secondhand shopping was morally equivalent to eating garbage. What she didn't know was that I often found vintage pieces that inspired my high-end designs, and that the simple jeans and sweater I was wearing had been chosen specifically because they were comfortable for spending long hours in my private studio, not because I couldn't afford better. "I like vintage pieces," I said truthfully. "There's something special about clothes with history." "History," she repeated, as if the word tasted unpleasant. "Is that what we're calling old and worn out now? How artistic of you." She turned to address the other family members who had been pretending not to listen to our exchange. "Isn't it sweet how Isabella makes the best of her situation? So inspiring, really. Not everyone can afford to stay current with fashion." My hands clenched involuntarily, but I maintained my expression of polite interest. This had been going on for years. Vanessa's need to establish her superiority through public humiliation, her assumption that my quiet lifestyle indicated failure rather than choice. Usually I could ignore her commentary, understanding that her cruelty said more about her insecurities than about my actual circumstances. But today felt different. Maybe it was because I'd spent the previous week watching celebrities fight over who would get to wear my latest creation to an upcoming awards ceremony, or because I'd just signed a contract for a collaboration that would put my anonymous designs in stores across 3 continents. The disconnect between my public persona and my private reality had never felt more pronounced, and Vanessa's casual dismissal of my worth struck deeper than usual. "You know," she continued, apparently not satisfied with the level of discomfort she'd achieved, "I've been thinking about your situation lately. Have you considered that maybe it's time to aim higher? I mean, you're not getting any younger, and that little retail job isn't exactly a career path with much growth potential." "I'm doing fine, Vanessa," I replied, my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "But thank you for your concern." "Oh, I'm not concerned," she clarified with another laugh. "I'm just saying that at 29, most people have figured out how to dress appropriately for family gatherings. It's almost like you're not even trying anymore." The conversation continued around us, discussions of vacation plans to places I could easily afford but had no desire to visit, mentions of charity galas and social events that held no appeal for someone who'd seen the shallow reality behind such gatherings. But I found myself fixating on Vanessa's words, particularly her assertion that I was not even trying when it came to my appearance. If only she knew how much effort I put into looking effortlessly unremarkable, how carefully I'd crafted an image that would allow me to move through the world without attracting the kind of attention that might compromise my anonymity. If only she understood that the woman she was mocking had dressed some of the most photographed people in the world, that my lack of fashion sense was actually a masterclass in strategic invisibility. "Actually," Vanessa said suddenly, as if struck by inspiration, "I have an idea. There's this gala next weekend, the Metropolitan Arts Foundation fundraiser. Very exclusive, very elegant. Maybe you should come as my guest." I looked up sharply, suspicious of any offer that came wrapped in Vanessa's particular brand of false generosity. "That's thoughtful of you, but you'd need something appropriate to wear," she continued, her eyes lighting up with malicious glee. "And I don't think your current wardrobe would be quite right for the occasion. It's black tie, very sophisticated, the kind of event where appearance actually matters." She paused dramatically, as if struck by sudden inspiration. "Tell you what, I'll lend you something. I have more dresses than I could possibly wear, and I'm sure we could find something that would make you look presentable." The offer hung in the air between us, loaded with condescension and barely concealed contempt. Vanessa was offering to dress me like a charity case, to parade me at a social event where my inadequacy would be on full display for her entertainment. It was humiliation disguised as generosity, a public demonstration of her superior status and my dependence on her largesse. But as I sat there, watching her face glow with anticipation of my grateful acceptance, a different idea began forming in my mind. The Metropolitan Arts Foundation Gala was an event I knew well, not as a potential attendee, but as someone whose work would likely be worn by several of the evening's most prominent guests. In fact, I had reason to believe that the evening's guest of honor would be wearing a dress I'd completed just 2 weeks earlier, a piece that had taken months to perfect and had already been featured in 3 major fashion magazines. "That's very generous of you," I said slowly, allowing a note of genuine gratitude to enter my voice. "But I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," Vanessa exclaimed, clearly delighted by what she interpreted as my acknowledgement of her superior position. "It would be my pleasure. Consider it sisterly support." The word sisterly carried particular weight, coming from someone who'd spent years systematically undermining my confidence and publicly questioning my worth. But as she spoke, I found myself thinking about the garment bags hanging in my private studio, containing pieces that would make her borrowed dress look like a costume from a discount store. "Actually," I said, as if the idea had just occurred to me, "I might have something that would work. I acquired a dress recently that might be appropriate for such an event." Vanessa's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Really? From where? I didn't know your budget stretched to formal wear." "It was a gift," I lied smoothly, "from someone who thought I should have something nice for special occasions." "A gift," she repeated, her tone suggesting she found this explanation highly unlikely. "How fortunate for you. Though I have to say, Isabella, formal events have very specific dress codes. It's not just about having a dress. It's about having the right dress, something that shows respect for the occasion and the other guests. I understand, I replied, keeping my voice neutral while internally savoring the irony of receiving fashion advice from someone whose wardrobe, while expensive, displayed all the creativity of a department store mannequin. Well, Vanessa said, with the air of someone making a significant concession, I suppose you could try your mysterious gift dress, but I'll keep my offer open just in case. I'd hate for you to feel out of place among the other guests. As the family gathering wound down and I prepared to leave, Vanessa cornered me near the front door with the predatory focus of someone who'd identified a particularly promising opportunity for entertainment. I'm so excited about next weekend, she said, her voice pitched loud enough to ensure that anyone within hearing distance would be aware of her charitable gesture. It's going to be such a wonderful evening. The guest list is absolutely incredible. Diplomats, celebrities, business leaders, people who really matter in this city. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I just want to make sure you understand what you're walking into. These people, they notice everything. The way you dress, the way you speak, the way you carry yourself. They can spot someone who doesn't belong from across the room. I appreciate the warning, I said, matching her whisper, while fighting the urge to smile at her complete misreading of my familiarity with such events. I'm not trying to make you nervous, she continued, though her expression suggested the opposite. I just want you to be prepared. Maybe we should meet beforehand so I can give you some pointers. You know, basic etiquette for high society events, which fork to use, how to make appropriate conversation, that sort of thing. The suggestion that I needed coaching on social graces was perhaps the most insulting thing she'd said all day, considering that I regularly attended similar events as part of my professional obligations. I'd shared conversations with Nobel Prize winners and heads of state, had been personally thanked by actresses whose careers had been enhanced by wearing my designs, but Vanessa saw only what she expected to see, a poor relative who needed guidance to navigate the sophisticated world she believed belonged exclusively to people like herself. That's very thoughtful, I replied, but I think I'll manage. If you're sure, she said with a shrug that suggested she was already anticipating the entertainment value of watching me fail. Just remember, confidence is key. Even if you feel out of your depth, try to project confidence. People respond to that. As I drove home through the city streets, past boutiques where my anonymous designs commanded five-figure price tags and galleries where I'd been secretly featured in exhibitions about emerging talent, I found myself actually looking forward to the gala for the first time since receiving the invitation months earlier. Usually, such events felt like work, opportunities to observe how my creations looked in their intended environment, to gather inspiration for future projects, to network with industry contacts who knew me only by reputation. But next weekend would be different. Next weekend, I would attend not as the invisible creator observing her work from the shadows, but as Vanessa's charity case, her demonstration of generous condescension toward the less fortunate members of her family. The irony was so perfect, it felt almost orchestrated by some cosmic sense of justice. That evening, I stood in my private studio surrounded by the tools of my trade, bolts of silk so fine they seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, beadwork that had been crafted by artisans whose skills had been passed down through generations, sketches and patterns that represented months of creative development. The space was my sanctuary, the place where I transformed abstract ideas into tangible beauty, where I could work without the need to explain or justify my vision to anyone. I moved through the organized chaos of my creative process, past mannequins displaying works in progress, past shelves lined with fabric samples and threads in every conceivable color, until I reached the climate-controlled closet, where I kept my completed pieces. My fingers traced the garment bags that contained dresses worn by women, whose names appeared regularly in magazines and gossip columns, gowns that had been photographed from every angle and dissected by fashion critics, who had no idea they were analyzing the work of someone they'd probably assume was beneath their notice. At the very back of the closet, wrapped in pristine white cotton and stored with the reverence reserved for museum pieces, hung the dress I'd been saving for a special occasion. It was a creation that had taken me nearly 6 months to complete, a piece that represented the culmination of everything I'd learned about design, construction, and the delicate art of creating garments that enhanced rather than overwhelmed their wearers. The dress was deceptively simple at first glance, a classic silhouette in midnight blue that appeared almost black under artificial light, but revealed its true color under the scrutiny of camera flashes or bright outdoor lighting. The fabric was a custom silk blend that I'd had woven specifically for this piece, its surface embedded with microscopic crystals that created an almost imperceptible shimmer, like starlight on water. But the real artistry lay in the details that wouldn't be apparent until someone examined the garment closely. The bodice was structured with an internal corsetry system that provided support and shape without the need for visible hardware. The neckline was cut with mathematical precision to flatter a wide range of body types, while maintaining an air of elegant sophistication. The skirt fell in perfect folds that moved like liquid, each pleat carefully calculated to create the illusion of effortless grace. Most importantly, the dress bore no visible designer label, no obvious markers that would identify its true origin or value. To someone like Vanessa, who equated worth with recognizable brand names and ostentatious logos, it would appear to be exactly what she expected from someone of my supposed means, a simple dress that had probably been purchased on sale or borrowed from a friend with better taste and a larger budget. As I held the garment up to the light, examining the way the embedded crystals caught and reflected the illumination, I couldn't help but smile at the poetic justice of the situation. Vanessa, who had spent years lecturing me about the importance of appropriate dress and social awareness, was about to wear a creation that represented the pinnacle of contemporary fashion design without ever realizing it. The following week passed with unusual anticipation as I prepared for what I'd begun thinking of as my grand reveal, though I had no intention of actually revealing anything to Vanessa directly. The beauty of my plan lay in its subtlety. She would experience the consequences of her years of condescension without ever understanding the true source of her comeuppance. I spent Tuesday morning at a consultation with one of the city's most exclusive fashion houses, reviewing sketches for a collection that wouldn't debut for another 18 months, but was already generating excitement among industry insiders. The irony of rushing from a meeting where my opinions were sought and valued by some of the most influential people in fashion to lunch with family members who considered me a failure wasn't lost on me. Wednesday brought a phone call from a celebrity stylist whose client wanted to commission a custom piece for an upcoming film premiere. We discussed timelines and creative direction, while I sat in the modest apartment that Vanessa viewed as evidence of my lack of ambition, surrounded by award letters and industry recognition that I couldn't display without compromising the anonymity that made my work possible. Thursday, I received advance copies of magazines featuring dresses I'd designed, worn by women who graced red carpets and charity events with the kind of effortless elegance that made fashion photographers weep with gratitude. I studied the images with the professional eye of someone analyzing her own work, noting how the garments moved and reflected light, how they enhanced their wearers' natural beauty without overwhelming their personalities. By Friday evening, I felt like an actress preparing for the performance of her lifetime. I'd arranged to have my hair and makeup done by professionals, whose services I'd used for industry events, though I instructed them to create a look that enhanced my natural features without appearing overly sophisticated. The goal was to look polished, but not transformative, elevated, but not unrecognizably glamorous. The dress fit perfectly, as I'd known it would, having designed it specifically for my own measurements, during a period when I'd been feeling particularly frustrated with the disconnect between my public and private personas. The midnight blue fabric skimmed my curves without clinging, the internal structure providing support that made me feel both comfortable and confident, ready to navigate whatever social challenges the evening might present. I chose simple jewelry, pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, and a delicate silver bracelet that I'd bought years earlier during a trip to a craft fair. No designer labels, no obvious displays of wealth or status. To anyone observing casually, I would appear to be exactly what Vanessa expected, a woman doing her best to look appropriate for an event slightly beyond her usual social sphere. But as I stood before my full-length mirror, examining my reflection with the critical eye of someone who understood the power of perfect fit and impeccable construction, I knew that anyone with real knowledge of fashion would recognize quality when they saw it. The dress might not bear a famous label, but it bore the hallmarks of true craftsmanship: perfect proportions, flawless execution, the kind of subtle elegance that couldn't be bought off a department store rack. Saturday evening arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn air and the promise of revelations that had been years in the making. I arrived at the hotel where the gala was being held precisely on time, neither early enough to appear overeager nor late enough to seem disrespectful of the event's importance. The lobby was already filled with guests whose names I recognized from newspaper society pages and entertainment magazines, people whose clothing choices would be photographed and analyzed in tomorrow's fashion columns. I spotted at least 3 women wearing dresses I'd designed, though none of them would ever know the identity of the creator who'd made them look effortlessly magnificent. Vanessa stood near the reception table, resplendent in a beaded gown that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, but lacked any sense of personal style or creative vision. She was holding court with a group of women whose conversations seemed to consist entirely of comparing jewelry and discussing vacation plans to places where the primary attraction was the opportunity to spend large amounts of money on unnecessary luxuries. When she spotted me approaching, her expression shifted through several distinct phases: surprise at my punctual arrival, automatic assessment of my appearance, and then something that might have been disappointment that I didn't look quite as out of place as she'd hoped. "Isabella," she exclaimed, her voice carrying the particular pitch that indicated she was performing for an audience. "You look nice. That dress is actually quite flattering." The faint condescension in her voice suggested that my appearance exceeded her expectations while still falling short of her standards, a careful balance that allowed her to maintain her position of superiority while appearing generous in her assessment. "Thank you," I replied simply, noticing how several of the women in her circle were examining my dress with the automatic evaluation that people in fashion circles applied to any unfamiliar garment. "Where did you say you got it?" one of them asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity, mixed with the kind of competitive assessment that characterized interactions among people who viewed clothing as a form of social currency. "It was a gift," I repeated, enjoying the small mystery that my vague answer created. "How lovely to have such generous friends," Vanessa interjected quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention my dress was receiving. "Shall we go in? I'm eager to show you around, introduce you to some interesting people." The ballroom was spectacular in the way that only truly expensive events could achieve. Flowers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, lighting that had been designed to flatter every complexion while creating an atmosphere of warm elegance, tables set with crystal and china that represented generations of craftsmanship and tradition. But what struck me most wasn't the obvious displays of wealth and taste. It was the way people moved through the space, the confidence that came from knowing they belonged among such luxury, the easy familiarity with surroundings that most of the world would never experience. These were people who expected beauty and excellence as their natural due, who would notice immediately if something was slightly off or inadequate. "Isn't it magnificent?" Vanessa asked, gesturing broadly at the opulent surroundings. "This is what I was talking about earlier, the importance of understanding your environment, of dressing appropriately for the occasion. Look around you, Isabella. Everyone here understands that presentation matters." She was right, though not in the way she intended. Everyone here did understand presentation, which meant they also understood quality when they encountered it. Several people had already glanced in my direction with the kind of subtle but appreciative attention that suggested my dress was registering in their consciousness as something worth noticing. "The woman in the midnight blue," I heard someone murmur as we passed a group near the bar. "That's exquisite work. Do you recognize the designer?" "No label visible," came the reply. "But the construction is flawless. Whoever made that understands proportion." I felt a small thrill of professional pride while maintaining my expression of polite interest in Vanessa's ongoing commentary about the evening's social dynamics and the importance of making good impressions on people who mattered. "Now remember," she continued in a lowered voice as we approached a group that included several prominent business leaders and their wives. "These people appreciate modesty. Don't try to dominate the conversation or pretend to know more than you do about topics outside your experience." The irony of receiving social advice from someone whose idea of sophisticated conversation consisted entirely of name-dropping and competitive materialism was almost overwhelming. But I nodded dutifully and allowed her to introduce me as her cousin Isabella, who works in retail but has such artistic sensibilities. The conversation that followed was exactly what I'd expected. Polite inquiries about my background that were designed more to establish social hierarchies than to express genuine interest. Discussions of mutual acquaintances and shared experiences that I was obviously excluded from, the kind of careful social positioning that people use to reinforce their sense of belonging among the elect. But something interesting began happening as the evening progressed. While Vanessa's friends initially treated me with the polite distance reserved for obvious outsiders, several of them began paying closer attention to my responses, my posture, the way I carried myself through conversations that touched on art, design, and cultural topics that I actually knew far more about than I could safely admit. "You have wonderful taste," one woman commented during a discussion about contemporary art exhibitions. "Have you had formal training in design?" "Just personal interest," I replied truthfully, though my definition of personal interest included years of professional study and practice. "It shows," she said with the kind of sincere appreciation that couldn't be faked. "There's something about the way you put yourself together that suggests real understanding of aesthetics." I caught Vanessa's sharp glance in my direction, her expression suggesting that the conversation wasn't developing quite as she'd anticipated. She'd brought me as a demonstration of her charitable nature toward less fortunate family members, but people were responding to me as if I actually belonged among them. "Isabella's always been creative," Vanessa interjected with a laugh that carried just enough edge to remind everyone of the social distance she'd established between us. "She makes the most of her limited resources." But her attempt to reframe the conversation only seemed to backfire as more people began examining my dress with obvious appreciation for its quality and construction. In a room full of expensive clothing, my anonymous creation was holding its own against recognizable designer labels and drawing exactly the kind of positive attention that Vanessa had assumed would be directed exclusively toward her own carefully curated appearance. The evening's program included dinner, speeches from various foundation board members, and recognition of major donors whose contributions supported arts education programs throughout the city. I found myself genuinely interested in the cause, having seen firsthand how access to creative education could transform young people's understanding of their own potential and value. During the dinner portion of the evening, I was seated at a table that included several prominent figures from the local arts community, gallery owners, collectors, and patrons whose support made possible the kind of exhibitions and programs that nurtured emerging talent. The conversation was sophisticated and engaging, touching on topics that I actually had professional opinions about, though I was careful to frame my contributions as those of an interested amateur, rather than someone with insider knowledge. "The challenge," one gallery owner was saying, "is identifying truly innovative work before it becomes commercially successful. There are designers working right now whose names we'll all know in 5 years, but they're still operating in relative anonymity." "Absolutely," agreed a woman who I recognized as one of the city's most influential collectors. "Some of the most exciting work is being done by people who aren't interested in fame or recognition. They're focused purely on the craft, on pushing boundaries without worrying about market considerations." I nearly choked on my wine, the description hitting remarkably close to my own professional philosophy and circumstances. "Do you follow fashion design?" the collector asked, turning her attention to me with genuine curiosity. "I find it fascinating," I replied carefully. "The intersection of art and function, the way clothing can express personality and emotion while serving practical purposes." "Exactly," she exclaimed with obvious delight at finding someone who understood her perspective. "And there are designers working now whose technical skill rivals the great couturiers of the past, but they're creating work that feels completely contemporary. Anonymous masters whose influence extends far beyond what most people realize." The conversation continued along these lines throughout dinner, with me contributing just enough insight to demonstrate genuine understanding while avoiding anything that might suggest professional involvement. But I could see Vanessa growing increasingly uncomfortable as people responded to me as an intellectual equal, rather than the charity case she'd intended to parade for their amusement. Her discomfort became more obvious during the evening's entertainment portion, when several guests approached our table specifically to compliment my dress and ask about its origins. Each inquiry was politely deflected with vague references to gifts and good fortune, but the accumulating attention was clearly not part of Vanessa's plan for the evening. "I don't understand what's happening," she hissed in my ear during a brief lull in the conversation. "People keep talking about your dress like it's something special." "Maybe it is," I replied, with a small smile that I couldn't quite suppress. "What do you mean?" Her voice carried a note of suspicion that suggested she was beginning to sense that something wasn't quite as it appeared. "Nothing," I said innocently. "Just that sometimes quality recognizes quality, regardless of where it comes from." Before she could respond, the evening's guest of honor was introduced, a celebrated actress whose humanitarian work had earned her recognition from organizations worldwide. She took the stage wearing a gown that I recognized immediately as one of my own creations, a piece that had taken months to perfect and had already been featured in major fashion magazines as an example of contemporary elegance at its finest. The dress was a masterpiece of subtle sophistication, ivory silk with hand-embroidered details that caught the stage lights like captured starlight. The actress moved with the confidence of someone who knew she looked magnificent, and the audience responded with the kind of appreciative murmur that greeted truly spectacular fashion moments. "Isn't she stunning?" Vanessa whispered, her voice filled with the kind of reverence she reserved for people whose fame and beauty she could never hope to match. "That dress is incredible. I wonder who designed it." I sat in silence, watching one of my creations receive the admiration of hundreds of people who had no idea they were appreciating the work of the woman sitting quietly among them, dismissed by her own cousin as someone too poor and unrefined to understand true elegance. The actress's speech was moving and articulate, touching on themes of creativity, perseverance, and the importance of supporting emerging artists who might not have access to traditional channels of recognition and success. But I found myself distracted by the reactions of people around me, the way they responded to the combination of her message and her magnificent appearance, the power of perfect design to enhance and amplify the impact of human achievement. "She's wearing Marceline Dubois," the woman next to me whispered with obvious admiration. "The detail work is extraordinary." Marceline Dubois was one of my professional pseudonyms, a name I used for my most exclusive commissions, when clients required the prestige of a recognizable designer signature. Hearing my fictional identity referenced with such respect, by someone whose opinion carried weight in fashion circles, felt surreal and validating in equal measure. "I've heard wonderful things about her work," I replied truthfully, though I was technically praising myself. "Very innovative approach to traditional techniques." "Oh, you know her work?" The woman turned to me with increased interest. "I've been trying to book a consultation for months, but she's notoriously selective about clients. She has very high standards." I agreed, enjoying the bizarre experience of discussing my own professional reputation, while maintaining my cover as someone entirely outside the fashion industry. The evening continued with a silent auction, featuring donated items from artists, designers, and celebrities who supported the foundation's mission. I found myself bidding on several pieces, not because I particularly wanted them, but because I genuinely believed in the cause and wanted to contribute something meaningful to the fundraising effort. Vanessa watched my participation with growing confusion that gradually shifted toward suspicion as she realized that someone she'd assumed was operating on a limited budget was casually bidding hundreds of dollars on charitable donations. "Isabella," she said during a quiet moment between auction items, "are you sure you should be bidding so much? I mean, I know you want to support the cause, but you don't want to overextend yourself financially." "I'll be fine," I assured her, successfully bidding on a painting by an emerging artist whose work I'd admired in gallery exhibitions. "Sometimes it's worth stretching your budget for something that matters." "But where are you getting the money?" she persisted, her voice carrying a note of genuine bewilderment. "Your job at the art supply store can't pay enough for this kind of spending." I could see her mental calculations working, trying to reconcile her understanding of my financial limitations with the evidence of my behavior throughout the evening. The expensive dress that drew admiring glances from fashion-conscious guests, the casual bidding on high-priced auction items, the way people responded to me as if I actually belonged among their social circle, none of it matched the narrative she'd constructed about my circumstances and limitations. "Maybe you don't know as much about my situation as you think you do," I suggested gently, watching her face process this possibility with obvious discomfort. As the evening wound toward its conclusion, I found myself surrounded by people wanting to exchange contact information, to continue conversations about art and design, to invite me to future events and gallery openings. They were responding to me not as Vanessa's charity case, but as someone whose opinions and perspectives they valued, someone they wanted to include in their social and cultural circles. "It's been such a pleasure meeting you," the collector said, as people began preparing to leave. "I hope we'll have the opportunity to continue our conversation about contemporary design trends. You have such interesting insights." "I'd enjoy that," I replied honestly, knowing that I could maintain my cover while building relationships with people whose company I actually enjoyed. "And that dress," she continued with obvious admiration, "is absolutely stunning. You must tell me where you found it. The construction is museum quality." Before I could respond with my usual vague deflection, she leaned closer for a more detailed examination of the garment's details. Her expression shifted as she took in the hand-finished seams, the invisible structuring, the precise placement of every element that made the dress fit and move like liquid elegance. "This is extraordinary work," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd studied fashion construction for decades. "Whoever made this is a master craftsperson. The technique is flawless. I felt a flush of professional pride, mixed with growing anxiety about maintaining my anonymity. The woman clearly knew enough about fashion construction to recognize exceptional work when she saw it, and her examination was becoming detailed enough to potentially compromise my cover story about the dress being a simple gift. "You're very kind," I said, attempting to deflect further scrutiny while acknowledging her expertise. "I'm serious," she continued, her eyes bright with the excitement of discovery. "I've been collecting designer pieces for 20 years, and I've rarely seen work of this caliber. The designer should be proud." Meanwhile, Vanessa stood beside us with an expression of complete bewilderment, clearly struggling to understand how her poor cousin's simple dress was receiving the kind of attention usually reserved for museum pieces and red carpet gowns. As we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave, several people made a point of saying goodbye to me personally, expressing hope that we'd meet again at future cultural events and art exhibitions. Their warmth and genuine interest stood in stark contrast to Vanessa's increasingly obvious confusion about how the evening had developed. "I don't understand what happened tonight," she said, as we waited for the valet to retrieve our cars. "People were treating you like you actually belonged there." "Maybe I did," I replied simply, enjoying her struggle to reconcile her preconceptions with the evidence of her own experience. "But you work in retail," she protested, as if reminding me of my supposed limitations would somehow restore the natural order of things that had been disrupted by the evening's events. "Retail can be very educational," I said with deliberate ambiguity, allowing her to interpret my words however she chose while technically telling the truth about my professional experience. The drive home gave me time to process the surreal experience of watching my anonymous creation receive recognition from people whose opinions carried weight in the fashion world, while simultaneously observing Vanessa's growing discomfort as her carefully constructed narrative about my inferiority crumbled before her eyes. The following Monday brought a phone call that would complete the evening's poetic justice in ways I couldn't have orchestrated, even if I'd tried. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Whitfield, the collector who'd been so impressed with my dress at the gala, calling to invite me to an exclusive private showing of contemporary fashion pieces at her gallery. "I can't stop thinking about that remarkable dress you wore," she explained, her enthusiasm obvious even through the phone. "I'd love to discuss it further, and I think you'd appreciate some of the pieces in my upcoming exhibition. Would you be available Thursday evening?" I accepted the invitation with genuine pleasure, looking forward to an event where I could engage with people who shared my passion for design and craftsmanship without the need to maintain the fiction that I was simply an interested amateur. Thursday's gallery showing was everything I'd hoped it would be, an intimate gathering of collectors, designers, and fashion enthusiasts examining pieces that represented the cutting edge of contemporary design. I found myself in conversations that challenged and inspired me, discussions about technique and innovation that fed my creative soul in ways that family gatherings never could. But the evening's most satisfying moment came when Margaret approached me with a particular piece she wanted me to examine, a dress displayed on a museum-quality mannequin, lit to showcase every detail of its construction and design. "This is from a designer who calls herself Marceline Dubois," Margaret explained with obvious admiration. "She's incredibly mysterious. No one knows her real identity, and she works only with the most exclusive clients, but her technical skill is extraordinary." I stared at my own creation, displayed like a work of art and receiving the kind of reverent appreciation usually reserved for historical pieces in major museums. The dress was one I'd completed 6 months earlier for a client who'd worn it to a film premiere, where it had been photographed extensively and featured in multiple fashion magazines. "It's beautiful," I said honestly, examining the familiar details with fresh eyes, seeing my own work as others saw it, not as the result of countless hours of labor and revision, but as a finished piece of wearable art. "The construction is flawless," Margaret continued, pointing out specific details that demonstrated advanced couture techniques. "Whoever Marceline Dubois is, she's working at the absolute pinnacle of contemporary fashion design." As I stood there listening to my professional work receive praise from someone whose opinion carried significant weight in the fashion world, I felt a deep sense of validation that had nothing to do with Vanessa's approval or recognition. My anonymous career had built something real and valuable, something that existed entirely independent of family dynamics or social expectations. The exhibition continued for several more hours, during which I met designers, collectors, and fashion historians whose knowledge and passion for their field reminded me why I'd chosen to work in anonymity rather than seeking public recognition. These people understood that the best work often came from artists who prioritized craft over celebrity, substance over visibility. When I finally returned home that evening, I found a voicemail from Vanessa waiting on my phone. Her voice carried a note of confusion mixed with what might have been grudging respect, though she was clearly struggling to understand how her assumptions about my circumstances had proven so dramatically incorrect. "Isabella, I've been thinking about Saturday night," she began, her usual condescending tone notably absent. "People were really impressed with you. I mean, genuinely impressed. And that dress, where did you say you got it again?" There was a long pause, as if she was waiting for me to provide an explanation that would restore her understanding of our relative positions in the family hierarchy. "Anyway," she continued finally, "maybe we should have lunch sometime. I'd like to understand your situation better." I smiled as I deleted the message, recognizing the invitation as Vanessa's attempt to gather information that would help her make sense of an evening that had challenged everything she thought she knew about her poor cousin's limitations and potential. Over the following weeks, I noticed a subtle but significant shift in our family dynamics. Vanessa's commentary about my appearance and lifestyle choices became notably less frequent and pointed, replaced by a cautious curiosity that suggested she was beginning to suspect there might be more to my story than she'd previously assumed. During our next family gathering, she made several attempts to probe for information about my mysterious dress, my apparent comfort at high society events, and my casual willingness to spend significant money on charitable auction items. But I deflected each inquiry with the same vague pleasantness I'd always used, maintaining the fiction that protected my anonymity, while allowing her to draw whatever conclusions she chose. "You know," she said during one particularly persistent questioning session, "I've been thinking that maybe I misjudged your circumstances. That dress you wore to the gala was really something special." "Thank you," I replied simply, offering no additional information that might satisfy her curiosity. "I mean, people are still talking about it," she continued, clearly fishing for details that would help her understand what had happened to disrupt her carefully maintained sense of superiority. "Margaret Whitfield asked me about you specifically. She said you had wonderful insights about contemporary design trends." The mention of Margaret's name confirmed what I'd already suspected, that my appearance at the gala had generated the kind of positive buzz that opened doors in social circles where Vanessa had previously been the undisputed family representative. "She's very knowledgeable," I agreed, enjoying Vanessa's obvious frustration with my unwillingness to provide explanations that would restore her understanding of our relative positions. As months passed, I continued to maintain my double life, with perhaps even greater appreciation for the freedom it provided. My anonymous career flourished, with commissions from clients whose names regularly appeared in entertainment and fashion magazines. The satisfaction of creating beautiful garments that enhanced their wearers' confidence and public presence never diminished, but it was enhanced by the knowledge that my family's dismissive assumptions about my potential had proven so spectacularly wrong. The dress that had caused such a stir at the gala was eventually donated to a fashion museum, where it became part of an exhibition about contemporary anonymous designers whose work was reshaping the industry from behind the scenes. I attended the opening reception as a regular visitor, standing among people who admired my creation without knowing its true origin, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from work that speaks for itself without requiring explanation or justification. Vanessa's treatment of me evolved from overt condescension to cautious respect, though she never entirely abandoned her belief that she understood my circumstances better than I did. She continued to offer advice about career advancement and social climbing, apparently convinced that my success at the gala had been a fortunate accident rather than evidence of abilities she'd never bothered to recognize. But her commentary lost its sting, becoming simply background noise that I could ignore while focusing on the work that actually mattered to me. Her opinions about my appearance and lifestyle choices became irrelevant once I demonstrated to myself and others that true quality and worth weren't dependent on her recognition or approval. The most satisfying aspect of the entire experience wasn't the temporary embarrassment I'd caused Vanessa, but the realization that I'd been allowing her narrow perspective to influence my own sense of value and potential. The evening at the gala had reminded me that my worth wasn't determined by family dynamics or social expectations, but by the quality of my work and the impact it had on people who encountered it. Years later, when fashion historians began documenting the influence of anonymous designers on contemporary style, my work would be featured prominently in exhibitions and academic studies, but the recognition that mattered most had come that evening when I watched my creation receive appreciation from people who understood craftsmanship and beauty, who could recognize excellence regardless of its source or the circumstances of its creator. The dress itself continued to generate interest long after the gala, appearing in fashion magazines and style blogs as an example of how true elegance transcended visible labels or obvious status markers. Each mention reinforced the lesson that quality work creates its own recognition, that genuine talent finds its audience regardless of the circumstances in which it's presented. My relationship with Vanessa settled into a more balanced dynamic, though she never fully understood what had shifted between us. Her attempts to maintain her position of family superiority became increasingly half-hearted as evidence accumulated that I was living a life more interesting and fulfilling than she'd ever imagined possible for someone in my supposed circumstances. She continued to display her wealth and status with the same enthusiasm, but her commentary about my limitations became notably less frequent and pointed. The memory of watching me navigate high society with apparent ease, of seeing sophisticated people treat me as an intellectual equal, had planted seeds of doubt about her assumptions that never entirely disappeared. I found myself genuinely enjoying family gatherings for the first time in years, no longer dreading Vanessa's critiques or feeling defensive about choices that had actually been carefully considered rather than dictated by financial limitations. Her opinion had become just one voice among many, and not a particularly informed or valuable one at that. The real victory wasn't in having embarrassed her publicly, but in having demonstrated to myself that her perspective on my worth and potential had always been fundamentally flawed. The confidence I'd gained from that realization extended far beyond our family dynamics, influencing my approach to professional relationships, creative challenges, and personal goals in ways that continued to pay dividends long after the specific incident had faded into memory. Looking back, I realized that the evening at the gala had been less about teaching Vanessa a lesson than about learning one myself. I'd discovered that the opinions of people who don't truly know or understand you carry only the weight you choose to give them, and that the most powerful response to dismissal and condescension isn't argument or explanation, but simply living well and doing meaningful work that speaks for itself. The dress that had started it all eventually found its way into a private collection, where it continued to be admired by people who understood its quality without needing to know its origin story. But for me, it would always represent more than just exceptional craftsmanship. It was a symbol of the moment I stopped allowing other people's limitations to define my possibilities, the night I learned that true worth creates its own recognition regardless of the circumstances in which it appears. In the end, Vanessa's greatest service to me wasn't the motivation she provided for my small act of poetic justice, but the contrast she offered that helped me appreciate the value of genuine relationships built on mutual respect and shared interests rather than family obligation and social positioning. The people I met through my anonymous work, colleagues who valued my skills, clients who trusted my vision, fellow creators who understood the satisfaction of making beautiful things, these relationships fed my soul in ways that family dynamics based on hierarchy and competition never could. The lesson extended far beyond fashion design or family relationships. It became a principle that guided my approach to all aspects of life, that authentic worth doesn't require external validation, that quality work creates its own audience, and that the most satisfying victories are often the quiet ones that restore your faith in your own value and potential, rather than seeking to diminish others. As I continued building my anonymous career, creating garments that enhanced their wearers' confidence and brought beauty into the world, I carried with me the memory of that evening when everything had come together perfectly: the right dress, the right audience, the right opportunity to demonstrate that assumptions about worth and potential are often more revealing about the person making them than the person they're directed toward. The midnight blue dress had been my masterpiece in more ways than one, proving that sometimes the most elegant response to dismissal is simply to excel so quietly and completely that your work speaks louder than any argument ever could.